Thank you. Good afternoon. This paper is co-written with two colleagues, Katsunori Seki, a PhD candidate at the University of Texas A&M, and my colleague Guy Whitten, is associate professor at the same university. So it's a recent research agenda on electoral accountability in European countries. I can start by apologize for because the paper is not available at time on the website. It should be done in the next hours. It's a long paper, 60 pages, so I'm going to summarize the main results on this topic. So the structure of my presentation, I will go briefly on the context of European economic crisis, and I will give some key points about the combination between economic voting theory, electoral accountability theory, and this specific context of economic crisis in Europe. For that, we propose a theory of taxation and voting, which is a bit new in this economic voting theory. Usually we use main macroeconomic indicators and not taxation. So we started to look at this new set of variables. I will present data analysis and some results, more convincing results, but as I said, it's in a sense, results are really fresh. So motivation of this paper, when Europeans went to the polls in June 2009, their national economies were in good shape. 4 years later, the Great Recession has affected most of European economies. And what was very surprising, like a puzzling question for political science, was the following one. Why most of incumbent governments have been defeated during this period? Left government, right government, except for Germany, Austria, but most of government have been defeated. So we want to know, we have two questions. Do economic hard times make defeats inevitable for any incumbent? Do voters sanction incumbent for poor economy, whatever the economic policy pursued in terms of public spending or taxation? And to what extent do economic voting theories capture the consequences of such bad electoral results for incumbents? So I can start with some brief, a broad picture of the Great Recession. I don't know, it's visible, yeah, that should be visible for all countries, European countries. We observe on this graphs that the evolution of public spending corresponds to a sort of cycle. So if the period is from 1965 to 2012, and except it for Ireland, Portugal, we have not a huge increase or decrease for public spending change. But if we remember the beginning of the Great Recession, all countries have decided to intervene in the economy by increasing public spending in 2009 and 2010. And after the surge of public spending increase, most of countries have decided to go back by cutting public spending due to different reasons. For some countries, there was a huge pressure from international organizations from their domestic economic situation. And the second evolution, which is not usually regarded or observed, it's about evolution of taxation. On this figure, we just put 4 countries to depict the evolution of taxation revenues. Data come from OECD, and it's for total tax revenues. And you can observe that it's like public spending. There is no homogeneous pattern for taxation. There is a rise and a decline for tax revenues. So the main point in our theory is to go back on the early theories of economic voting. We have a lot of papers on economic voting. I remember this paper of Lewis Beck and Stegmaier in 2008, which evaluates the most of 400 papers on economic voting, and there is a sort of consensus about one model dominates, the retrospective and sociotropic economic voting model. But at the beginning of this first models of economic voting, the relationship between economy and vote choice was probably too simple. On the left, you have the seminal paper by Kramer in 1971, and to evaluate the evaluation of economy, the assessment by voters should be direct, simple to explain vote choice. And we learned by different scholars that it's not so direct. There is a first selection of politically relevant economic indicators. So 3 indicators have dominated the literature: unemployment, growth, and inflation. And if we look at these 3 main variables, we have some robust and significant results for explaining vote choice according to the 3 economic variables. But maybe I can go back. Most of these papers have regarded the mechanism of economic voting by using macro data at the aggregate level. In a second stage, some scholars have regarded economic voting theories by using individual data. And in this case, we have 2 new research avenues. The first is the introduction of the clarity of responsibility argument, because there was like a puzzle at the end of the 90s. Who is to be blamed for bad economic performance? And Guy, Whitten, and Powell in 1993 published in EGPS a very interesting paper on this argument of clarity of responsibility. The basic idea was to say we need to know in the executive who is responsible or not for a bad or good economy. So that was the first addition to the economic voting model. The second addition was to theorize a party ideology in this model. And it's very close to this literature on political business cycles with some scholars like Ips, Alesina, and so on, who made a statement that left government are more concerned about unemployment and public spending, and right government are more concerned about inflation and taxation. But it's not really convincing, because most of empirical studies were performed during the rise of welfare states, and the last or more recent papers on political business cycles are absolutely not in my perspective, not convincing, and we have not very strong results about the partisan cycles. There is still some significant result about the opportunistic cycle, but not for the partisan cycle. So in this paper, we add a third component of the complete economic voting model by using some short indicators of short-term policies. And as I mentioned in the introduction, taxation policy is a new actor of the end of the Great Recession. And if you remember the evolution of patterns of total tax revenues, all countries have increased by about 2 to 12% the level of taxation. And all kind of taxation, individual taxation, income tax, corporate taxation, taxation on goods and services, social contributions. So we have different aspects of taxation. And in this model, we argue that taxation policy is used by government to react to economic crisis, but in the same time, taxation policy could be driven by government ideology. So if we combine these two different contextual variables, and in the same time, by using the argument of clarity of responsibility, we should observe different patterns in terms of vote choice. So our expectation are not so simple than this table mentions. So we have our 4 macroeconomic variables. The third ones concern the the conventional wisdom of economic voting, growth, unemployment, and unexpected inflation. And for these 3 variables, if we split our sample between left and right government and unclear responsibility and clear responsibility, we can expect that growth is usually a gain for incumbent government, left or right. For unemployment, left government should be more concerned about unemployment than right governments. And for inflation, that's the opposite. Right government are more concerned than left government. And now for taxation change, we have no clear direction for government when we cannot attribute a clear responsibility. But for the last part, the 2 last columns of this table, we have strong expectation, saying that for left government, an increase of taxation should not be bad news for them. I mean that voters should not punish left government if taxation increase, but that the opposite for right government. So our specification, it's a bit puzzling because we have, as I mentioned, 3 contextual variables, and we have the lagged vote, because vote is supposed to be incremental. So if we try to explain the incumbent vote, because remember the question is why most of incumbent government have been defeated during the period of recession. So we have to interact different contextual variables with economic or macroeconomic indicators. So at the end of this specification, we interact tax policy with incumbent ideology, economic conditions, and clarity of responsibility. The problem with our sample is that we have not sufficient number of observations. So to create an interactive variables with 3 arguments, means that you reduce the number of degrees of freedom. So we've decided to adopt another research design by sampling our population to create some subsets according to ideology, clarity of responsibility, and the last one, periods of prosperity versus periods of recession. So our dependent variable is very simple, the voucher of the chief executive's party. The independent variables, 5 categories. First, our usual macroeconomic indicators. About policy, taxation, we have run different estimations with all these categories of taxation. I'm going to present 2 of them, total tax revenues and individual taxation, because in the economic voting literature, we argue that people should observe more easily how taxation affects them, and not for corporate taxation or social contributions. About politics, we have coded for all countries the level of clarity of responsibility. It's a dummy variable. Right and left, we have used data from Budge and the lagged voucher. And 2 other dummy variables, recession time and prosperity time. So between 1965 to 2012, we have only 15% of our sample concerned by recession, 85% or prosperity. It's no recession time. And also because we use OECD data, we sample for European OECD countries. So two sets of results. First, the first column is a baseline model for all election, whatever the clarity of responsibility, ideology, or recession time or prosperity time. So you observe that in this case, we have only one significant result for the lagged variable. So, and the lagged variable explains most of the variance of this model. Now, if we subset with the clarity of responsibility argument, things are really different. So for unclear responsibility, it seems that increasing taxation for left and only left government increases their vote share. And now, if we look at for the same government, left government, when the clarity of responsibility is included, you observe that the coefficient increases by 50%. Is doubling. So you have a huge increase of this coefficient for taxation. And for the other variables, it's usual. We have growth, a positive sign as expected, a negative sign for unemployment rate for right or left government, and only when we add the clarity of responsibility argument. Otherwise, results are not significant. That's the first picture. Second one, if we look at now not total tax revenues, but only individual taxation, I mean income taxation, we have only one significant result for taxation. This time is for a right government with the unclear argument of responsibility. So we have no strong explanation for this result. The only good thing is to get a negative sign as expected, but it's not really robust. And finally, if we look at now the period of recession and prosperity, for all this estimation, we have a clarity of responsibility assumed, and we have now 2 interesting results. First, only left government are concerned about taxation policies. And we have a positive sign, so it means that during recession time, the last column, left government have absolutely not been punished by an increase of taxation. And in case of prosperity time, we observe that it's further that taxation increases the voucher for left government. So it's interesting because we have no significant result for right government, so it means that something happens in terms of taxation for left government. In conclusion, so it's really a first attempt to input taxation within the usual economic voting model, and at the aggregate level, it's very hard to find in the literature papers on taxation, preferences for taxation, ideology at the individual level. We have some papers for the US and Sweden. Second conclusion, taxation policies have effect on incumbent electoral patterns, net of economic performance measures, because I have not time to mention, but all the other macroeconomic variables still remain significant, and left government are probably the main policy decision makers to be positively affected by an increase of taxation. And we have still some more puzzling interaction when we use in the same model the evolution of public spending and taxation. I have not time to present, but in the paper you will see such results. Thank you.
Thank you.